Russia says airstrikes overnight on ISIL positions inside Syria have killed 12 fighters. Moscow's military campaign has entered a third day. Syrian monitoring groups say the targets included ISIL's stronghold of Raqqa province. Meanwhile, Turkey and its partners in the US-led coalition against ISIL say they are concerned about Russia's actions. They're worried that rebels opposed to the Kremlin's ally, Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, are bearing the brunt of the airstrikes. Russia's foreign minister has confirmed that their target is not just ISIL but other armed groups like the Al-Nusra Front. France, which is also part of the US-led coalition, says Russia should only target ISIL and no other groups. The French president is meeting Russian leader Vladimir Putin in Paris today. We'll hear from our correspondent in the French capital in just a moment. But first, and Al Jazeera's Zena Hodder is monitoring the situation in Syria for us from neighboring Lebanon. She joins us live from Beirut. So Zena, it's the third day of Russian airstrikes in Syria. What have you learned as far as the situation on the ground is concerned?
Well, like you mentioned, the third day of airstrikes, a new wave of airstrikes announced by the Russian Defense Ministry, saying since last night there were 18 sorties, 12 ISIL targets were hit. According to the Defense Ministry, the targets were in the provinces of Idlib, that's in the north of the country, as well as Aleppo and Hama. No mention of what the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights is reporting. That group is saying that Russian warplanes were active over Raqqa, which is an ISIL stronghold. According to the observatory, there were strikes in Raqqa as well as in the town of Quraitain, which is in the eastern countryside of Homs, two ISIL strongholds. But like I mentioned, the Russian Defense Ministry has not yet confirmed whether or not this is true. But if it is, it would really mark the first time the airstrikes are targeting an area where ISIL really has a strong presence. ISIL does not have any presence in Idlib or in the Hama countryside. But and this has really had raised a lot of questions about Russia's aerial campaign, its focus. Some in the opposition, Syrians in the opposition, have been telling me that their aim is not just to target ISIL, but to get rid of what they are calling what is left of the opposition in order to help the Syrian president Bashar al-Assad. So a lot of questions, but the Russians are making it very, very clear. For them, the terrorists on the ground are not just ISIL, but other groups as well. And this is causing a lot of anxiety among Syrians. What we do know is that two groups which were trained and supplied by the US military, their bases were targeted. I spoke to the commanders of both of these groups, and they're wondering why are they being targeted in this campaign.
Zena, thank you very much. Zena Hodder live for us in Beirut. Syria is on the agenda of a meeting in Paris between the French President François Hollande and his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin. They'll be later joined by German Chancellor Angela Merkel and the Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko to discuss the situation in Ukraine. Niamh Barker is in Paris for us. He joins us now live. Niamh, this meeting in Paris was called to discuss the peace efforts in Ukraine, of course, but it's been somewhat overshadowed by the crisis in Russia and the Russian airstrikes. Will there be a dialogue on Russia's intervention in Syria?
Well, inevitably, as this is the first meeting between Vladimir Putin and Western powers since Russia launched airstrikes against Syria. Syria, of course, will be high on the list of things to be discussed here in Paris, and does, of course, run the risk of eclipsing the Normandy 4 talks about finding a peaceful solution to the conflict in Ukraine altogether. Over the course of the afternoon, we expect to see bilateral talks taking place between the French president and Putin, and Chancellor Angela Merkel of Germany and Putin also. We've got to remember, of course, that in the last 24 hours, tensions between the West and Russia have significantly ramped up after Russia admitted that it was targeting more than just ISIL targets in Syria. The concern of the United States, of course, being that US-backed Syrian rebel targets would also likely to be hit. So tensions within those bilateral meetings between Putin, Hollande and Putin and Merkel are expected to be very high indeed. The message from Western powers is likely to be that airstrikes against targets in Syria by the Russians are indiscriminate and run the risk of prolonging the conflict even further. The response from Russia, though, is likely to be that the only way to bring about lasting peace in Syria is to back Assad, and the information that we've gained this morning suggests that the Russian airstrikes will continue for somewhere between 3 to 5 months.